Welcome, tankers, to the Ground Nation Guide for War Thunder. In this episode, we'll be going over the USSR. The full playlist can be found in the description. The Soviet tank tree is one of the biggest, oldest, and most popular in the game. Wherever you look, you can find iconic tanks in every tier, from the T-34s to the IS series and some of the best top-tier vehicles as well. The Soviet doctrine was to build as many tanks as possible to overwhelm the enemy, and their main battlegrounds were the flat terrains of Eastern Europe. What this means in-game is that nearly all Soviet tanks lack reverse gears and gun depression, but we'll get to that later. With Stalinium and Russian bias protecting your tanks, you have nothing to fear though. The tree is divided into 5 lines, those being the medium, heavy, and light tank lines, the tank destroyer line, and the SPAA line. Like the American tree, there's a variety of playstyles to pick from, and each lineup contains vehicles capable of different things. First up, we have Tier 1, with some classic early war designs. In the first line, we have the BT series of tanks, the acronym standing for Fast Tank in Russian, with the BT-5 and BT-7s. These three are absolute speed demons with top speeds of up to 60 kph on the 7M model. Like most tanks at this tier, armor is quite lacking, even 50 cals can wipe them out, but their mobility more than makes up for that. They all feature the 45mm 20K cannon, which fires powerful shells, has a quick reload, but has a rather poor turret traverse rate, so keep that in mind. All three models are excellent for beginners to learn the basics of ground battles, as they're both fun and easy to use. Next, we have the T-28 series. These two rather imposing medium tanks are surprisingly nimble for their size, and the latter variant carries decent firepower to boot. The APHE shells they fire have a high amount of explosive filler, so if you manage to penetrate the enemy's armor, it'll probably be a one-shot kill. That being said, they are classified as medium tanks for a reason. Their armor is not great, and combined with their size, you have to be extra careful while playing them. The size can be an advantage though. If the enemy doesn't hit your ammo, you can survive a decent while thanks to the abundance of crew members. Play them like support tanks with some allies watching your back, and try not to face enemies head on. Next up, we have the T-26s, the T-60, and the T-70. Both T-26 models have poor mobility, thin armor, and low survivability, and the T-26-4 has a low muzzle velocity to top it off. The latter variant is just bad in general, but the regular T-26 has good firepower at least, with a punchy 45mm 20K. The BT series is just way better though. The T-60 on the other hand features a fast-firing autocannon. Its armor-piercing build should be enough to deal with most enemies from the side, but after firing a mere 58 rounds, you have to wait quite a while for the reload to finish. Not only that, but its paper-thin armor makes it a very vulnerable vehicle, so close-range supporting is the name of the game. Lastly, the T-70, which is a much more versatile vehicle. With its 45mm cannon, half-decent mobility, and some relatively thick sloped plates at the front, it's a great light tank. While the armor is good, survivability is a different story, with only 2 crew members and a slow hand-cranked turret, which is a common theme across all 4 vehicles. If you get flanked, you're pretty much done for, so keep the situation under control at all times. Next, we have the tank destroyers with the Su-51 and Su-76M, Su standing for self-propelled units in Russian. While the 5-1 has a great 76mm cannon, it can only carry 8 shells, and its survivability is a joke. It's meant for holding down positions like cap points in a concealed area, and if you set up some ammo crates, you can one-tap unsuspecting enemies. They can easily do the same thing to you though, so staying hidden is crucial. The 76M improves on some much needed areas, with better protection, a lot more shells at its disposal, and an even more powerful 76mm cannon. It features quite the selection of rounds, but your go-to should be its APHE shell with a couple APCR shells if needed. Like the 5-1 though, it also has exposed crew members, and armor isn't great either, so keep your distance and rack up some kills. Lastly, in the anti-air line, we have the Gaz AAA-4M and Dishka. These two meme machines are, what's the word? challenging. Yeah, let's go with challenging. The design is very human. It's a Russian pickup truck with Ivan in the back doing a Slav squad holding either 4 Maxims or a single Dishka. Mobility is great, armor is non-existent, and firepower is alright. The 4M or 4 Maxim machine gun setup is okay against aircraft, but not so much against tanks, while the Dishka is the opposite, where you might have some difficulty hitting planes, but you can reliably pen the sides of tanks. Neither of them can look straight up though, and the Dishka variant can't fully rotate its gun either, as if they didn't have enough issues already. If you'd like to keep your sanity, then maybe skip these two, but if you're already on your way to an asylum, then by all means. Next we have Tier 2, which is where the tech tree starts to take shape. In the medium tank line we have the T-50 and the early variants of the T-34. The T-50 is a surprisingly resilient light tank with solid mobility and firepower. The sloped frontal plate is pretty trolly and you can bounce a lot of shells coming your way, but if it gets penetrated you'll likely die in one shot. The flanking role suits it best. Now we move on to the T-34s, the bread and butter of the Soviet tank tree. These early variants are excellent medium tanks that feature the holy trinity of ground vehicles: good mobility, firepower, and armor. Their upper frontal plates are capable of bouncing a lot of shells, but the key to making the most of it is by angling. Like with the German Tigers, angle your tank so that the edge of the hull faces the enemy. Their turret cheeks are a common weak point though, but if you stay on the move, it'll make it difficult for enemies to aim for it. Thankfully, they have great top speeds of roughly 50 kph, which lets you get out of tricky situations and into more favorable ones. As for firepower, they all carry a 76mm cannon, the 1940 model having the somewhat lackluster L11 variants, while the 1941 and onwards carry the upgraded F34 with a longer barrel, which boasts better penetration and more ammo choices. The latter three variants are quite similar, their main differences being that the last two have better armor than the 41. You really can't go wrong with any of these, as they're both very versatile and effective. The best way to play them is by staying on the move, angling your hull, and using hit and run tactics. Next, in the heavy tank line, we have the T-28E, KV-1s, and the KV-2. The T-28E, with the E standing for shielded in English, has additional armor plates like its name suggests. With better armor comes a higher BR though, which makes it somewhat redundant. The KV-1 is a much more interesting tank though. The L11 variant is like the American Jumbo in many aspects, with amazing armor, not the best mobility, and a weak cannon. If you angle it properly, enemies at your BR won't be able to pierce you from the front. Like I said though, its bad mobility and lackluster firepower hold it back. Getting some teammates to support you is a good idea because enemies can easily overwhelm you if you're alone. The KV-1S trades some of the armor for better mobility and firepower, with a better top speed and the improved ZIS-5 cannon. It fixes a lot of the issues that its predecessor had, but its worse armor makes it a bit more vulnerable. Keep your hull angled and help out your allies and you'll be good to go. Finally, we have the KV-2, also known as Stalin's fridge launcher. This colossus features a 152mm howitzer that can wipe any tank off the face of the earth. With its slow turret traverse, 40-second reload, tall profile, and subpar mobility though, it's hard to use effectively. Your main strategy should be to peek out, take a shot at an enemy, and retreat back into cover. Some supporting allies are necessary if you don't want to get overwhelmed. In the light tank line, we have the T-80, a direct upgrade from the T-70. This model has an extra crew member, an even faster reload rate, similarly great mobility, and the reliable 45mm 20K. It has slightly worse turret protection, but gets even more hull armor. Enemies who underestimate this little machine will see their shots bounce off the upper frontal plate. Like its predecessor though, it has an awful turret rotation rate, so keep an eye out for flankers. Next, in the tank destroyer line, we have the ZIS-30, Su-57B, Su-122, and Yag-10. The ZIS-30 is an iconic light tank destroyer with great firepower but no armor to speak of. Its decent mobility allows it to get to some good vantage points before the action starts, and with up to 145mm of penetration, you won't have much trouble taking enemies out. The Su-57B is a casemate that features the same 57mm cannon but with slightly slightly better protection. Don't let that fool you though, pretty much any cannon or heavy machine gun can take it out, even from the front. Play it similarly to the ZIS-30 and stay out of sight. As for the SU-122, it's a self-propelled assault gun. Like the German Sturmhaubitze, it carries a howitzer that packs a good punch but doesn't have much muzzle velocity. On top of that, it also has a 20-second reload, which can make it rather tricky to use. Play it like a lighter KV-2 and peek in and out of cover to provide fire support. Lastly, we have the Yak 1029K. It's quite similar to the German flak truck, with no armor, great firepower, and a fast reload. If you unlock its optical rangefinder, you can be a great long-range sniper, but be sure to relocate every once in a while to avoid detection. Lastly, in the SBAA line, we have quite a selection of vehicles: the GAZ-MM, BTR-152A, ZIS-43, ZIS-12, and ZSU-37. Time for another speed round. The GAZ-MM and ZIS-12 feature a single and dual 25mm cannon setup respectively, both mounted on the Russian milk truck we all know and love. They're both quite speedy and have great firepower for both anti-air and anti-tank action, but the armor situation is the same as the previous models. Hit and run tactics are where they shine. The BTR-152A, however, uses an armored personnel carrier instead of a truck, as well as a dual 14.5mm heavy machine gun setup. The 14.5s have excellent fire rates along with fast turret rotation speeds, both in the horizontal and vertical. While it might not be as good against tanks as the previous two, it can absolutely shred enemy aircraft to pieces, and combined with this great top speed, you can be a real pain for the enemy team. Armor is still pretty bad though, so avoid getting spotted. As for the ZIS-43, it's one of the vehicles of all time. Mobility sucks compared to the previous trucks, but its 37mm is good against tanks once you unlock its AP belts. Depending on the user, it's very underrated, or if you're like me, think it's complete trash. On to greener pastures, we have the ZSU-37. It packs the same gun as the ZIS-43, but with better mobility and access to HVAP belts, along with slightly better protection. Its armor is still not great, but not as bad as the trucks. It's a solid pick for supporting your allies, as you can both take down enemy aircraft and deal with enemy tanks to some degree. Next up, we have Tier 3, which contains some of the classic World War II Soviet tanks. In the medium tank line, we have the T-3457 and T-3485D5T. The former is quite similar to the Tier 2 models, but featuring the powerful 57mm ZIS-4 cannon. It's got a fast reload and decent penetration, but the post-pen damage is somewhat lackluster. The latter, on the other hand, features the deadly 85mm D5T cannon, which packs more than 160 grams of explosive filler on its APHE-BC round. Assuming you know enemy weak spots, the early T-3485 can be a one-shot machine. Mobility on both models are quite good as well, with a top speed of roughly 50 kph on either one. Armor is something they both severely lack though. While their front plates are angled, they're also very thin, so any tank with a half-decent cannon can take them out head-on. The flanker playstyle is where they shine, so stay out of sight and stay on the move. Next up, in the heavy tank line, we have the KV-1 ZIS-5, KV-85, and the IS-1. The new KV-1 variant is similar to its predecessor, but with even more armor and a better cannon. These two upgrades are welcome additions to an already strong vehicle, especially the extra firepower. Mobility and especially maneuverability are still pretty rough though, and its turret is still a weak point. As for the KV-85, it's an upgraded KV-1S with the hull of its predecessor but the turret of its successor. Like I said before, the 85mm cannon is a force to be reckoned with. Like the KV-1S though, you definitely shouldn't rely on your armor, especially at this battle rating. And lastly, we have the IS-1. Firepower wise, it features the tried and true 85mm D5T. While it's classified as a heavy tank, mobility is rather good when spaded, but its armor can be easily penned by enemies like Tigers, Panthers, Sherman Fireflies, and more. That being said, it has a surprisingly fast reverse speed, so reversing into battle is unironically a valid strategy. The engine block eats up a lot of enemy rounds, so drive backwards and take some back shots while your 85mm gets the job done. Next, in the light tank line, we have the ASU-57 and PT-76B. The ASU is a small yet mighty vehicle featuring a 57mm cannon with amazing penetration for its BR. Mobility is pretty good, and being one of the tiniest vehicles in the game as well, it can be a very sneaky ambusher. Even a single machine gun round can take it out though, so you have to be extremely careful while using it. The PT-76 is a bit different. Instead of a tank destroyer, it's an amphibious light tank. With a 2-plane stabilizer and some powerful heat FS shells, it can be a menace against heavy tanks that rely on their armor. Speaking of armor, the PT has pretty much none, and the stock grind can be painful as well, with subpar mobility and some weak stock shells. With some modifications though, it can be a great addition to your lineup. Next up in the tank destroyer line, we have quite a selection with the SU-152, SU-85, ISU-152, SU-85M, and the ISU-122. The SU and ISU-152s are self-propelled heavy assault guns with a 152mm howitzer. Like the KV-2, they have absolutely devastating firepower, long reloads, and mediocre mobility and armor. Use them to provide heavy fire support to your allies. The SU-85 and SU-85M are more conventional tank destroyers with the same 85mm cannon we all know and love. Armor isn't great on the former, but the latter has additional plates that can stop a lot of shells. Like with any casemate TD, your main strategy should be to stay out of sight and engage enemies from afar. And lastly, for the ISU-122, it carries the same powerful 122mm cannon as the IS-2 at a lower battle rating, at the cost of being a casemate, not having much mobility, and a slow reload rate as well. Long distance sniping is the way to go. Last but not least, in the SPAA line, we have the BTR-152D. This thing is pretty much identical to the BTR-152A, but with 2 additional 14.5mm machine guns. As you might expect, double the firepower means double the pain, and it makes it a lot easier to shoot down aircraft as well. With its higher BR, you might have trouble against enemy tanks, but it's nothing a bit of flanking can't fix. Coming up next, we have Rank 4 with some late World War II and early Cold War vehicles. The medium tank line contains the T-34-85 and the T-44. The 85 is nearly identical to the D5T, but with access to APCR shells, a slightly faster reload, an extra crew member, and more armor on its turret. It plays exactly the same, so make use of its great mobility and firepower. After all the T-34s, we finally reach a new design with the T-44. It addresses the biggest problem with the 34s, that being armor. It features a highly sloped upper front plate that protects it from the majority of enemies it faces. Not only that, but it retains the excellent mobility of its predecessors with a top speed of nearly 60 kph. Its firepower is the only thing holding it back though, with the same 85mm ZIS cannon as the T-34-85. At this increased BR range, you're gonna have some difficulties against late war heavies, so keep that in mind. Next, in the heavy tank line, we have 2 variants of the IS-2. Compared to the IS-1, these 2 tanks crank the firepower to the max with the 122mm D25T cannon. This monster can obliterate pretty much anything it hits with up to 230 mils of pen on its later shell. After firing, you need to wait roughly 27 seconds to reload though, so make every shot count. The 1943 model is pretty much just an IS-1 with the aforementioned cannon, while the 44 has a much better upper front plate, a roof-mounted dishka, and access to smoke and add-on armor. Like with the T-44 though, their turrets are a massive weak spot. Keeping your distance and getting some allies to back you up is therefore crucial, especially due to its long reload rate. In the light tank line, we have the ASU-85 and SU-100P. The 85 is like the bigger brother of the ASU-57 with a deadly 85mm cannon that can fire 300mm penetrating heat FS shells. With good mobility, access to an optical rangefinder and smoke barrels, and a decent reload to boot, it can be a great flanker and ambusher in the right hands. The SU-100P packs a similarly powerful gun, namely the 100mm D50 with APS HE rounds that can pen up to 240mm. Mobility is even better than on the ASU-85 with a top speed of up to 63 kph. All these factors combined make it an excellent flanker and sniper. Armor is severely lacking on both though, so avoid enemy detection like your life depends on it, because it quite literally does. Next up in the tank destroyer line we have the ISU-122S, the SU-100, the 2S1, and the 2S3M. The ISU-122S is almost identical to the ISU-122, just with a semi-automatic breech block that improves its fire rate, while the SU-100 is basically the SU-85M with a 100mm cannon. Compared to the 122mm, the shells it fires have less explosive mass but better velocity and penetration values. Neither have great armor nor fast reload rates, but if you keep your distance, you can be effective at sniping. As for the 2S1 and 2S3M, they feature 122 and 152mm howitzers instead of conventional anti-tank cannons. Most tanks you'll face are gonna rely on their armor to protect them, but a well-placed HE round with up to 10 kilograms of TNT pretty much ignores whatever it faces. Armor is non-existent, mobility is quite solid, and the reload times are slow, especially on the 2S3M. Use their strengths to their advantage and provide heavy fire support. Lastly, in the SPAA line, we have the BTR-ZD and M5359. The BTR and the Praga are pretty similar. They both have a dual autocannon setup, they're both quite fast, and they can absolutely shred enemies to pieces. The former features the 23mm ZU-23 cannons. It's great at anti-air work and can pen the sides of tanks if needed. The Praga, on the other hand, carries the 30mm ZK453s, which have up to 91 mils of penetration on their HVAP belts. Think of it as a modernized ZIS-12 milk truck. Zoom around the battlefield, take down planes and tanks alike, and avoid detection. Both the BTR and Praga have a high fire rate, so taking down enemy planes shouldn't be difficult at all. Just make sure to stay out of sight and keep moving though. Armor is quite sparse. Next we have Tier 5, featuring early Cold War vehicles. In the medium tank line we have the T-44-100 and 3 variants of the T-54. The T-44-100 is an upgraded T-44 with a powerful 100mm cannon, a roof-mounted dishka, side skirts, as well as access to smoke barrels. The firepower issue is solved thanks to the 100mm, which can penetrate up to 240 mils of armor, but at this increased BR range, shells like Heat FS can punch straight through your upper front plate, so you have to play more carefully. A more modern design is found in the T-54s. All 3 variants pack the same 100mm cannon as the T-44-100, but with a shorter reload, access to more shells, as well as better armor. The main differences between the 3 are their turret designs, with the latter 2 models also firing APDS and Heat FS as well. Mobility is also decent enough to keep up with most contemporaries. For downsides though, their turret traverses are awful, the stock grind is painful, and their armor doesn't mean much against modern shells. Play them like the T-34-85 and stay on the move while avoiding enemy detection. Next up in the heavy tank line we have the last 2 IS tanks with the IS-3 and IS-4M. These 2 metal beasts are the successors of the IS-2 with even thicker and more angled armor that can withstand pretty much any kinetic shell fired at it. That being said though, they suffer greatly from late heavy tank syndrome, which means they'll dominate in a down tier but suffer greatly in up tiers. The fact that they carry the same cannon as the IS-2 doesn't help. The terrible turret traverse and very slow reload rate can be a massive detriment when you're facing fast tanks with autoloaders. These 2 heavies are relics of a different time, but while they might not be that great, they can still be fun depending on the match's BR. In stark contrast, we have the light tank line with the BTR-80A, BMP-1, and Object 906. All 3 of these vehicles are amphibious, mobile, and deadly. The BTR is a Russian 8x8 APC that carries a 30mm autocannon. Seeing as it has amazing mobility and a not so powerful gun, the RAT playstyle is its vocation. Flank and scout enemies, kill the ones you can pen, and harass the ones you can't. The BMP-1 on the other hand packs a 73 23mm low velocity smoothbore. With its auto-loader, it can fire one heat grenade after another, each with 300 mils of penetration. If that's not enough, you can launch either a keyboard or mouse-guided ATGM to seal the deal, depending on the modification. Save your missiles for enemies far away, as the main gun doesn't have much muzzle velocity. Lastly, we have the Object 906, a modernized PT-76. It carries a stabilized 85mm cannon with an auto-loader and has access to both APHE and HEAT-FS. Mobility is excellent in both forward and reverse, which is a novelty in Soviet vehicles. It's an overall fun tank to use, and like with the previous two lights, if you keep moving and stay out of sight, you can rack up kills with ease. Next, we have the tank destroyer line with the Su-122-54, Object 268, and the 2S-19M1. These three are the last Soviet tank destroyers with conventional cannons, and pretty devastating ones at that, with a 122 and 152mm gun respectively. The 122 can fire APDS and HEAT-FS if necessary, while the 152 is a big derp gun with a powerful HE and APHE shell. Along with this, they both carry a 14.5mm machine gun, the same as on the early BTRs, which can deal with planes and light vehicles. Mobility is surprisingly good on both, while armor is decent against kinetic shells but not so much against chemical ones like HEAT-FS. With a long reload as well, you should keep your distance from the front lines with both and snipe enemies from afar. As for the 2S-19M1, it's like a Soviet Panzerhaubitze 2000. Massive firepower, short reload, not much armor, and tall profile. If you've played the previous self-propelled howitzers, you should be familiar with its playstyle, so stay back and provide heavy fire support. Lastly, in the SBAA line, we have the ZSU-57-2, ZSU-23-4M2, and the ZSU-37-2. The 57 is classified as an anti-air, but it might as well be a tank destroyer with more than 150mm of penetration on its armor-piercing shells. Combined with decent mobility as well, it can make quick work of an enemy team if you position yourself correctly. It's not the best anti-air due to its low fire rate, but luckily the ZSU-23-4M2 is a lot better in that regard. Like its name suggests, the Afghan variant of the Shilka carries 4 23mm stabilized autocannons that can fire 850 rounds per minute, a short burst from which can absolutely shred enemy aircraft to pieces. It doesn't have much penetration, so you should focus on the anti-air role. The ZSU-37-2 is the best of both worlds, with a fast fire rate, decent armor-piercing shells, a 2-plane stabilizer, and a radar. It's not perfect in either role, but if you want a vehicle that can do both anti-air and anti-tank work, it's a decent choice. Coming up next, we have Tier 6, which is where the designs get modernized and improved. The medium tank line turns into the first MBT line with the T55A and AMD1, T62 and T62M1, and the T72A. The T55A improves on the 54s with a 2-plane stabilizer and access to darts, while the AMD1 variant also has composite armor on its turret, an active protection system, laser rangefinder, and access to ATGMs. They're good jacks of all trades with decent mobility and firepower, but their hull is easily pennable by enemy cannons. The T62s are similar, but with a more powerful 115mm cannon and a lower profile. Like the AMD1, the M1 also has composite armor, a laser rangefinder, and access to anti-tank missiles. Last but not least, we have the T72A, another change in design. This time around, the MBT features composite armor, a laser rangefinder, an auto-loader, as well as the powerful 125mm 2A46 cannon. Like the previous 4 tanks, hull armor is pretty abysmal, while the turret is decently strong, now with the added disadvantage of the huge carousel auto-loader in the middle of the tank. Concealing your hull and engaging enemies from a distance is therefore crucial, and its 125mm is well suited for the sniping playstyle. The heavy tank line turns into the second MBT line with the T10M, Object 435, and the T64A and B. The T10M is the pinnacle of Soviet heavy tanks with thick armor all around, surprisingly good mobility, a stabilized 122mm cannon, and two 14.5mm heavy machine guns. Depending on the matchmaker, it can either be an armored medium tank or a glass cannon. Its reload rate is the main thing holding it back, so the sniping or supporting role is the best option. As for the Object 435, it's pretty much the T62 but better, with more armor, slightly better mobility, access to a rangefinder, and a 14.5 Vladimirov on the roof. Stay out of sight and snipe enemies from afar. The T64s on the other hand are similar to the T72A. Strong turrets, weak upper front plate, an autoloader, and a 125mm cannon. The B variant is better than the A in nearly all aspects, with access to a laser rangefinder, ATGMs and better darts, smoke grenades, and ERA packages if you get the BV modification. Their playstyles are unsurprisingly like other Soviet MBTs at this BR. Don't rush the front line, stay hold down, and take enemies out from a distance. In the light tank line, we have quite the selection, namely the BMP-2, Object 685, BMP-3, and the 2S25. The BMPs are speedy IFVs that feature autocannons and ATGMs. The BMP-2 can be a bit more aggressive thanks to its faster reload and fire rate, while the BMP-3 is better as a light tank destroyer with its better missiles and laser rangefinder. They're honestly some of my favorite vehicles in the entire tree, combining mobility and firepower to create a fun playstyle. The Object 685 and 2S25 on the other hand are more conventional light tanks with 100 and 125mm cannons respectively. Combine that with some great mobility and you have two versatile tanks capable of scouting, flanking, and sniping. If you're more of a fan of big guns instead of autocannons, then these two are some solid options. Next, in the tank destroyer line, we have some interesting vehicles, namely the IT-1, Sturm S, and the Object 775. The IT-1 is an anti-tank missile launcher based on the chassis of the T-62. With a nearly impenetrable turret, some powerful ATGMs, and decent mobility as well, you can be an effective tank destroyer if you find a good hold down spot. The Sturm S takes a different approach. It replaces the armor with better mobility. Not only that, but it also has thermal imagers and access to tandem charge and proximity fuse ATGMs as well. The lack of armor can really be a hindrance though, as aircraft and heavy machine guns can wipe you out. Lastly, we have the Object 775, a peculiar looking vehicle. The Soviet Pancake has an extremely low profile as well as an adjustable suspension system, allowing it to hide in some unexpected places. Like the IT-1, the Object also has some very solid protection in the front, and with a 6-second reload you can deal some serious damage. Having only 2 crew members and the lack of tandem charge ATGMs at this BR kinda hurts, but I mean come on, it's a funny looking tank, what's not to love? Lastly, for the SBAA line, we have the ZSU-23-4V and ZSU-23-4M4. The Shilka is pretty much the ZSU-23-4M2, but with a tracking and detection radar at the cost of having 2,000 less rounds. Like its predecessor, you can obviously pulverize enemy aircraft that fly close thanks to the quad 23mm cannon setup, and the radar is definitely a welcome addition. If the enemy is far away though, the 4M4 variants will come in handy, with 4 manpads strapped to its turret. The missiles aren't anything amazing, but they're nice to have against long-range opponents. Now the moment you've all been waiting for with tier 7 and 8, containing late Cold War and present day vehicles. In the first MBT line you'll find the T-72B and B-1989, T-90A, T-72B3, and T-90M. This line generally focuses more on armor, with mobility being more of an afterthought. Let's start with the T-72s. The B variant is a direct upgrade to the A, with much better composite armor behind the upper front plates and Contact 1 ERA blocks all around the vehicle. This turns the UFB from a weak spot to one of the strongest parts of the tank, and the ERA packages will block nearly all chemical energy shells like stock Heat FS. The 1989 model replaces the Contact 1 with the more modern Contact 5 blocks, which has increased protection against kinetic shells like APFSDS. Firepower stays the same with the excellent 125mm 2A46 with some very strong darts and ATGMs, but their optics are pretty subpar as they don't have zoom nor thermals. That's where the B3 model comes in, featuring thermal imagers, up to 12 times optical zoom, and access to tandem charge missiles. Not only that, with the UBH modification, the tank gets further upgrades in the form of a better engine and the improved relict ERA. Hull armor is the same as the 1989 model though, so at this increased BR you shouldn't rely on it too much. Now we move on to the T90s. The A variant is a modernized T72B with Contact 5 ERA as well as the Stora electro-optical APS that can deflect some older missiles. The downside is that it's one of, if not the most sluggish MBT in the tree, and it also has a pretty slow turret rotation rate, so you have to play it a bit more carefully compared to the rest. The M variant features relict ERA, a better engine, better optics, and a laser warning system among others. Long distance sniping is where it shines, and you can easily do so with its powerful APFSDS or tandem charge ATGMs. The second MBT line features the T80s with the B, U, and BVM variants. The T80s put more of an emphasis on speed while still retaining decent armor. The B model is quite similar to the T64s, but with much better protection and mobility, along with some nice additions like thermals and an ERA modification. The U model boasts an even better engine, which lets it keep up with its NATO contemporaries, along with access to Contact 5 ERA, the 3B M46 APFSDS shells with up to 530 mils of penetration as well as better optics. Lastly, we have the BVM, the ultimate T80 variant. Featuring relict ERA, the 3B M60 darts and tandem charge ATGMs, and the same great engine as the U, this model is a solid jack of all trades with decent armor, mobility, and firepower. The same weaknesses are still present though, such as the vulnerable driver's port and gun breach, bad gun depression, slow reverse speed, etc. Nevertheless, the BVM is a great all-rounder that excels at flanking and sniping. Next in the light tank line we have the 2S25M. Compared to the original, the M variant lacks a reverse gearbox but improves on the fire control system with better optics, 3rd gen thermals, and access to the 3B M60 darts as well as tandem charge ATGMs. Like the previous model, use its speed to flank enemies and stay on the move to avoid getting spotted. In the tank destroyer line, we have the Chrysanthema S. Like the Sturm, it's a lightly armored missile carrier that can fire deadly tandem charge ATGMs, some of the most powerful ones in the game in fact. This time around though, you have 2 launchers as well as a radar system for both air and ground targets. You heard that right, it can spot and lock onto enemy tanks, even through bushes, smoke, etc. It's a very situational vehicle though, as the lack of armor and the long reload rate can leave it quite vulnerable. Stick to long range sniping, find a hold down spot, and make sure not to get detected. And lastly, we have the SBAA line with the OSA AKM, Strela 10M2, 2S6, and Pantsir S1. The former two, named Wasp and Arrow respectively, are self-propelled SAM carriers, each with their strengths and weaknesses. The OSA carries a detection radar, better optics, and the missiles it fires have more than 10 kilometers of range, making it an effective helicopter killer. The Strela, on the other hand, has a much better turret traverse and carries fire and forget missiles that have better pull, which is more effective against jets. If you want the best of both worlds though, the Tunguska has you covered. With 8 surface-to-air missiles, a tracking and detection radar, as well as 4 30mm autocannons, it's a formidable vehicle to face. If you unlock the M1 modification, you get to use thermals, and the missiles get up to 10 kilometers of range. If that's not enough, the Pantsir is the ultimate air defense system. On top of the quad 30 mils, this Russian 8x8 truck carries 12 missiles with an unprecedented 20 kilometers of range. It's currently the top dog of anti-air missile systems, only rivaled by few, and if you keep your eyes open, you can easily take care of enemy aircraft before they even get to the battlefield. Like the flare aircraft though, it's quite a massive vehicle, so try not to stay out in the open. Conclusion time, starting with the pros and cons. The majority of Soviet tanks across all the tiers have sloped armor that can bounce a lot of shells. Obviously, some of them like the T-34-85 have thin plates, but the added angle of impact makes them a lot stronger than they'd normally be. Along with this, Soviet tanks also generally have some great APHE shells with ballistic caps and plenty of explosive filler, making them effective against angled armor and having good one-shot potential. Like the Americans, the Soviet tree has a decent number of playstyles to pick from, whether it's flanking, sniping, ratting, or anything else. They're a classic jack of all trades, but also a master of none. Being a part of the big three, they're also pretty much guaranteed to get new tanks every update. Now for some of the cons though, starting with the two most blatant ones, namely gun depression and reverse speed, or lack thereof. Due to Soviet doctrines, nearly every single tank in the tree has abysmal depression angles and reverse gears. Even a small inclination can lead to your downfall, and if you need to back out of a situation, you're out of luck. This means you can't just hold W and expect to win, you have to think about each step you take. Another con is the size of the tree. The big three status is both a blessing and a curse, as the tree is one of the biggest in the entire game. If you're looking to get to top tier, you better be in for the long haul. That being said though, here's a pro tip from your pal SK. The tank destroyer line is entirely skippable. If you're like me and you don't really care for some mediocre casemates with limited playstyles, you can just not research them and climb the ranks quicker. Now for the rankings. Like I said, the Soviet tree features a diverse list of playstyles, with flanking and brawling at the forefront. As for the ranks, the tree starts off strong, takes a bit of a dive in the middle, but reclaims its glory at higher tiers. Close air support is abundant, as the Soviet air tree features plenty of ground attackers and tactical bombers, and once you get to top tier, you'll get your hands on some of the best modern CAS systems available. As for anti-air, while the early milk trucks are, to say the least, abhorrent, the tree contains some very good ones like the PTRs, ZSU-23s, and so on, not to mention their amazing top tier choices. And at last, we have the ultimate question: should you play the Soviet tank tree? If you're a beginner, it's a great pick. Their early tanks are decently fast, and combined with their angled armor, you can learn the basics of ground battles with relative ease. Be wary of the lack of gun depression and reverse speeds though, those are common pitfalls for newer players. If you're looking for a new nation to grind, the Soviets are an okay choice. The tree might not specialize on any given playstyle, and with its big size, you'll be grinding for a decent while. However, there are some solid lineups, and once you get to top tier, you'll have some competitive vehicles waiting for you. And if you're just looking to have some fun, go for it. Regardless of the tier, you can find some enjoyable vehicles and lineups, and dabble in some classic Russian biased machines like the KV-2 and the milk trucks. Two of my personal favorites are the T-34-85s and the ASU-57.